In this lecture, our job is to make sense of where the energy comes when a muscle is looking for ATP to use to contract. So let's first start a little bit by talking a little bit about ATP itself. Mitochondria are where ATP is produced, and ATP is made using the energy that's stored in glucose. And so here, if this is an illustration from chapter 3, chapter 2. If this is new to you, you may wish to go back to chapter 2 and look a little bit about cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is the process that takes glucose, reacts it with oxygen, and in the process, in all of that process of reacting glucose with oxygen, we are able to take a phosphate group. That's what they're showing here. Is we take this phosphate group, which is phosphorus plus several molecules, hydrogen, carbon, some oxygen, are all involved in this phosphate group. But we'll just, not carbon, just it's PO4. It's oxygen. So it's a phosphorus that that's bonded to some oxygen molecules and has a space where it can be attached to a molecule of ADP. ADP means adenosine diphosphate. And we have ADP available. That's an A. We have ADP available in the cytosol. So it's there, it's near the mitochondrion, it's available and ready to be built. So we have this ADP, which is an adenosine molecule. So it's this 5-carbon sugar. It's built off of adenine, which is one of the nucleotides, one of the molecules that's used to build DNA and RNA. So ADP already has 2 phosphate groups attached to it. That's why it's called adenosine diphosphate. And one of those phosphate groups is attached to the other with this. Notice that we, rather than a straight line indicating the chemical bond, we have this kind of curvy line. You can see them here. I've already destroyed this one, but you can see them up here. It's kind of that wiggly line. That indicates that it's a high energy bond. And when you take ADP and attach a 3rd phosphate to it, then you make adenosine, and I'm sure you've already seen this, adenosine triphosphate, which is what ATP means. So adenosine triphosphate has a 2nd high energy bond in it with that 3rd phosphate group attached using that high energy bond. And it's in that high energy bond that we can store the energy that is going to be used to drive muscle contraction. It's also used to drive a lot of other chemical reactions in the body that require energy being given to them. And so this is what's referred to as a reversible reaction, because later we use ATP to store energy. It's kind of a short-term storage place for energy. And when we use that energy, we break this high energy bond, harvest that extra high energy that's found there, and a phosphate group is released, and ATP is turned back into ADP again. So it's a reversible reaction because we can just cycle this ADP through cellular respiration, attach a phosphate group using that high energy bond, and then very shortly afterward break that high energy bond and use the energy. So ATP is a super important molecule in the body because it's how we briefly store the energy that we're releasing from glucose. And so we're constantly, all the time, making ATP in our cells breaking down glucose, putting the energy into the ATP molecules, and then harvesting that energy shortly afterward to run cellular processes, producing ADP once more. So if glucose is available, if oxygen is available, then for every glucose molecule that we have in the cell waiting to be have its energy taken from it, we can produce 36 or 38 ATP molecules. And it depends on what cell we're dealing with, how many ATP molecules we can make. If it's a heart or a liver cell, then we can produce 38. All the other body cells can only harvest 36. It just depends on the very specific kind of cellular respiration that is done. And this graphic that I found here shows you where we pull what part of the chemical reactions of cellular respiration we can get that ATP from. There's a process called glycolysis that allows us to strip out 2 ATP molecules. The end product of glycolysis is 2 of these molecules called pyruvate. Pyruvate is then sent into the mitochondrion. So here's a mitochondrion. And sorry about that. And if you recall, mitochondria have a double membrane. So here's the outer membrane, here's the inner membrane. We run the pyruvate through a process called the citric acid cycle that produces 2 more ATPs, and then we send the end products of the citric acid cycle through a series of enzymes referred to as the electron transport chain, and from the electron transport chain we can produce 34 more ATP. So there's a total then of 38. So this must be in a liver cell or in a heart cell, because we're making a total of 38 ATP here. So that's making ATP. We can get a lot of it from one glucose molecule. And during muscular contractions then, so here's how it fits back in to the processes of muscle contraction. We use the ATP to detach and reset these myosin cross bridges, so that part of the myosin protein molecule that attaches to the actin molecules, ATP is used to disattach them from actin and to reset them, to get them back into their high energy conformation so that they can reach up and make a new connection as soon as a binding site is available. And we also use ATP to take calcium out of the sarcoplasm, get it back out of the cytosol of the muscle cell, and then draw it into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So I should have said into right here, the SR. Okay. So where do we find, or where in the cell is the energy found? Is this ATP energy found? Well, muscle fibers can only store enough ATP, because ATP is a fairly short-term energy source. They can only store enough ATP to power just a few twitches, just a few very short-term contractions of the muscle cell. And so with that stored ATP that we have laying around at any one time in the muscle cell, we can produce contractions for something like 4 to 6 seconds. So we have to be constantly making ATP if we're going to continue contracting the muscle. And just to be clear here, ATP is the only energy source that can be used directly in muscular contractions to reset the muscle fiber to be able to contract again, or to contract additionally. But it's not the only way that we store up energy in the cell. We have some other products that we have laying around that can be very quickly converted into ATP energy. All right, so only ATP can be used, and we only store enough ATP to do 4 to 6 seconds or so of muscular contractions. But fortunately for us, we have some other forms of energy that we have lying around in the cell. So let's see what some of those other forms are. First, the second and most easily accessible form of energy is found in a molecule called creatine phosphate. So we can quickly build ATP molecules using stored creatine phosphate molecules. There's the fastest, quickest way to get some energy. We also store glucose in muscle cells. If you recall, glucose is stored as glycogen granules in the sarcoplasm. So they're in the cytosol of the muscle cell. We have glycogen sitting around. And if we have oxygen, then we can continuously do aerobic respiration. That's that respiration that uses oxygen to get the 36 or 38. But sometimes when we run, well, not sometimes, always, when we run out of oxygen, and that happens sometimes, then we can use a process called anaerobic respiration, which is cellular respiration without any oxygen. Now, it doesn't produce even close to the same amount of ATP when we use glucose through anaerobic respiration, but it can keep us going, which sometimes, it's a moment of desperate measures, or desperate times call for desperate measures. And so we can do this really desperate measure of anaerobic respiration if we don't have sufficient oxygen in the muscle cell to do aerobic respiration. Because it's easy to run out of oxygen, not only we can also store up additional oxygen in the cytosol of the muscle cell, and we store it attached to a molecule called myoglobin. You've probably heard of hemoglobin. That is an oxygen storage molecule that's found in red blood cells. We have a similar molecule called myoglobin. Myo, again, remember that means muscle. Oop. Come on. So this is a globular protein that is found in muscle cells. It's actually just a reddish brown pigment which gives muscles their reddish color, and we can attach oxygen to that myoglobin so that we can store up more oxygen than we would be able to store up in other cells in the body. Okay, so energy source, once we use up ATP, we can go to creatine phosphate and use that to make ATP. And while we're using that stored creatine phosphate, then we can do aerobic respiration to make more ATP to have it available. And when we run out of oxygen, then we can do anaerobic respiration. So that's sort of the pathways that we go about building ATP with in order to have sufficient energy to keep our muscles contracting. And in order to store up additional oxygen, we use myoglobin. All right, because oxygen is so frequently a limiting material in the process of cellular respiration. Okay, so we'll start by looking at creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate, like adenosine triphosphate, is a high-energy compound. And we can store it. Creatine phosphate is much more stable form of energy storage than ATP is. And so we can produce, while we can only produce small stores of ATP at any one time, we can create much larger stores of creatine phosphate. So when there's a lot of ATP available in the cell, then we fill up the closet, fill up our larder with creatine phosphate. And we do this by taking ATP, ripping off the phosphate group, and producing ADP. So we take ATP, turn it into ADP by taking off the high energy phosphate group. And we take creatine and attach that phosphate group to it, producing creatine phosphate. Okay? So creatine phosphate is just a creatine molecule with a phosphate group attached to it using a high energy bond. So they should be showing this kind of this high energy bond. So we've got energy stored in that high energy bond. Later on, when ATP is low in the cell, we reverse the reaction. We take creatine phosphate, we rip off its phosphate group, leave creatine behind as the end product there, take ADP and attach that phosphate group to it to make ATP again. So we can very quickly transfer our phosphate group back to ADP to make lots of ATP very quickly. So when a muscle cell uses up ATP, creatine phosphate is available to restock very quickly the ATP by taking any ADP that's laying around and giving it that phosphate group and attaching it with a high energy bond. And then that energy, that ATP energy, is quickly made available again. So that's the first place that our body goes as we begin to become low on ATP in the cell, is the stored up creatine phosphate. Now, we have 4 to 6 seconds of muscle contracting energy in the cell in the form of ATP. We have another 10 seconds of creatine phosphate available in the cell. And so the creatine phosphate will be relatively quickly depleted from the cell. And it's good to use. The reason that we use creatine phosphate is because it's a good medium-term storage molecule for storing up energy. ATP is a very relatively unstable molecule, and so it can't hold on to its phosphate group for a very long time. Creatine phosphate is it's like a medium-term storage form of energy there in the muscle fibers. So as we deplete creatine phosphate stores, then the muscle will go into what's called aerobic respiration. So if we have glucose and oxygen, then we can produce 36 or 38 ATP molecules. And so as long as there's oxygen and glucose available in the muscle cell, then no problem. We can keep the muscle working just like we're wanting it to be able to work. If we start to run low on glucose, no problem, because the liver has stored up glycogen as well, and it'll release that glucose into the bloodstream, and the muscle cells will very quickly be resupplied. If we run low on glucose throughout the body, so that as we start to deplete the glycogen stores in the liver, we can also use fatty acids, amino acids, and glycerol. They are all molecules that have energy in them. They don't have as much energy in them as glucose does, but we can use them to assemble. I'm going to take that back. I said they don't have as much energy. They do. Fatty acids and glycerol. They are the components of the fat lipid molecules that we find in our adipose cells. So there's a lot of energy there. And so as we run low on glycogen stores in the liver, we can go to our fat stores and use the fatty acids and glycerol in our fat stores to build the glucose molecule So we have to do this intermediate step. We can't use lipids directly, but we can take lipids, convert them into glucose, and use that glucose to make ATP. And if we get low on fat as well, then we may turn to amino acids, to our proteins, and we can take amino acids and convert them into glucose. This is work that's done in the liver, and then use that glucose to make ATP. So it takes a long time to run out of total energy in the body. This is why people can run marathons. It's because, you know, they've got a lot of energy stored up in other ways in the body. The much more limiting factor generally in making ATP through aerobic respiration is the supply of oxygen available. And once we run out of quickly available oxygen, then things get a little bit harder for the cell. But we find dissolved in the fluids of a muscle cell oxygen. That's the oxygen that's immediately available to do the processes of aerobic respiration. And as we deplete the cytosol stores, then we have additional oxygen stored up as in the myoglobin, or with the myoglobin molecules. And so as we use up the oxygen freely available in the cytosol, then we turn to the myoglobin stores to release oxygen there. Okay, so aerobic respiration is the next source, and as soon as we start using ATP, the cell will begin or rapidly enters aerobic respiration, so that we very quickly replace the ATP stores. As the ATP stores dwindle, then creatine phosphate is used to make ATP, and but we're still doing cellular respiration at the same time, so that we can keep adding to the ATP stores that are available for muscle contraction. When we run out of oxygen in the cell, and we still are calling and needing ATP, then we can do a process called anaerobic respiration, also known as fermentation. And yes, it's exactly the same thing as when we ferment sugars into alcohol. But with this fermentation of glucose in the cells, rather than going on to make alcohol, our end product is a material called lactic acid. So if we don't have sufficient oxygen available, then we can still make some ATP, not very much. Every glucose molecule that is anaerobically processed, so I'm going to show there's no oxygen available, we can produce 2 ATP molecules. That's a far cry from 36 or 38 ATPs. But again, desperate times call for desperate measures. So we make 2 ATPs, and then we also make 2 lactic acid molecules. And so lactic acid begins to build up in the muscle cell as we do this anaerobic or respiration or fermentation process. So the point at which oxygen becomes limiting in the cell, and the cell shifts from doing aerobic respiration to doing anaerobic respiration, or without oxygen respiration, is referred to as the lactic acid threshold. So that's that point when we run out of oxygen, and our cells begin, or we run out of oxygen in the cell. Now there's still oxygen in the blood, and we're trying desperately to get oxygen to the cell. And as oxygen arrives, we're going to do a little bit of aerobic respiration when it gets there, but we're still not meeting all of the ATP requirements. And so that's when we hit that lactic acid threshold, and we start doing this not so efficient form of respiration. And as lactic acid builds up, That makes the interior of the cell acidic, which is not a good place for the cell to be. And so we start moving lactic acid out of the cell, and as it leaves the cell, we're losing energy that could have been available to make ATP if we had had oxygen from the cell. And all that stuff gets shuttled back to the liver. The good news is that once we have lots of oxygen available to us, then we can use that lactic acid to rebuild the glucose molecules. Okay, so here I'm just showing you a small graphic of the anaerobic fermentation process. So we have glycogen, we convert it into glucose. Along the way, then that glucose will be converted into pyruvic acid, 2 molecules of it. We extract ATP, 2 of them in this process. We produce lactic acid. Lactic acid then gets carted off to the liver, and it is, with a little input of ATP molecules, 2 of them, that lactic acid can be reconverted back into glucose. If we need that glucose again, then we can send it out into the bloodstream. If we're not needing a lot of energy at that point, then we'll just store it away as glycogen in the liver. So, as lactic acid gets produced in the cell, then it will diffuse from the muscle cell into the blood, is carried back to the liver, and when we have oxygen available to us again, then we'll reconvert the lactic acid into glucose. And notice that while we can take 2 ATPs out of glucose when we do anaerobic respiration, it takes 2 ATPs later on to reconvert it back to glucose. But that doesn't happen until after oxygen is available once again to the body, after we've stopped working and have had a chance to rest and recover. All right, there we have it. Everything I wanted to tell you about aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration, the sources of ATP as we work our muscles.